who said these racist words?
The trouble with the Jews is not his blood, which can mix with ours without disastrous results, but his persistent and antagonistic culture tradition. On the other hand, the Negro represents a vastly inferior biological variant, which must under no circumstances taint our Aryan stock.
A member of a white supremacist group, an ignorant politician, or one of Rhode Island's most famous and revered authors. You might find this hard to believe, but these words come directly from a letter written by Howard Phillips Lovecraft. This month on Adam Miner Investigates, H.P. Lovecraft, racist. August 20th, 1890, Angel Street, Providence, Rhode Island. A monster is born. You can feel a slight bit of pity for the young Lovecraft. He never had a chance at a normal childhood. Raised by an insane mother and simpering aunts, he often had his hair curled and was dressed in little girl's clothing. His mother wanted a daughter. She could often be heard saying, well within earshot of young Lovecraft, that he was an ugly child. An ugly, ugly child. Lovecraft was born at this site on Angel Street, which is now a Starbucks. He only had one pet growing up as a child, a black cat, which he named Nigger Man. When Lovecraft is 3 years old, his father suffers a nervous breakdown. He is brought here to Butler Hospital. 5 years later, he's dead of what was most likely syphilis. Lovecraft himself suffered lifelong afflictions of nervous disorders, most likely brought on by the torture he endured as a child, torture his mother inflicted upon him. In 1919, his mother also suffers a nervous breakdown and is brought here to Butler Hospital. She never leaves, and 2 years later she dies of a botched gallbladder operation. In 1904, Lovecraft attended Hope High School. His love for the Jews did not grow.
It was there that I formed my ineradicable aversion to the Semitic race. The Jews were brilliant in their classes, calculatingly and schemingly brilliant, but their ideals were sordid and their manners coarse. I became rather well known as an anti-Semite before I had been at Hope Street many days.
Lovecraft believed that the segregation that was practiced in the South should also be brought to the North. He believed that the blacks should be put out of sight or massacred so that the white man could walk the streets without being nauseated.
The Negro is fundamentally the biological inferior of all white and even Mongolian races, and the northern people must occasionally be reminded of the danger which they incur in admitting him too freely to the privileges of society and government.
We're here with Rory Raven, mentalist, and we're going to discuss Lovecraft tonight. Rory, how are you doing tonight?
Good, Adam. How are you?
Excellent.
There are a lot of folks who want to say that Lovecraft's racist views weren't all that extreme for somebody of his time and his class and his sort of culture. You know, that most early 20th century cultured folks of white Protestant had that kind of attitude. So the racist sentiments that he expressed weren't really all that extreme when you look at the time and the place. That's not really quite right. I mean, he's way out there.
Right.
I mean, you would expect a certain amount of racism, but with him it gets really nasty. This is a guy who took the subway in New York and mentioned that he felt like he was on one of John Brown's ships during the Middle Passage when he looked around at his fellow passengers.
Thanks.
That's unpleasant. So he's definitely out there, and the folks who want to say, oh no, he's not that much of a racist, I think are just not wanting to hear the great man slandered.
So do you think that Lovecraft just ignored all the information that he could have gotten to disprove his own race, and his ideas of everyone being inferior to the Aryan races, and how his incredibly low opinion of non-Aryan races? He had information that would have disproved all this. Do you think he just ignored it, or do you think he didn't see that information, you know?
I think he probably saw it and dismissed it. One of the biographers mentioned that a couple of Lovecraft's friends said that he was always very good at rationalizing things. And he was always good at rationalizing his faults, and I'm sure he would then probably be very good about rationalizing the arguments of other folks, saying that you know, other races aren't inferior or superior, and it's just a silly idea. One biographer did point out that several people who knew him always said that he was very good on a one-to-one basis. I forget who it was. It might have been Clark Ashton Smith, who said that, you know, if a black guy fell down in the street, Lovecraft would have been one of the first people to run over and say, "You okay? Can I help you?"
Oh, that's really interesting.
So while it seemed to be a dislike of the group as a whole, it seemed to get considerably toned down on a one-to-one basis, and he did marry a Jew.
In 1921, Lovecraft takes a trip to Boston, and there at a convention he meets Sonia Greene, a Russian Jew. He begins courting her in 1922, and on March 3rd, 1924, Lovecraft and Sonia are married. He moves into her Brooklyn apartment. The following quote should be a good indication of what he thought of that fine city.
The population is a mongrel herd with repulsive mongoloid Jews in the visible majority, and the coarse faces and bad manners eventually come to wear on one so unbearably that one feels like punching every goddamn bastard in sight.
Most people consider New York City to be the greatest place on earth, but not Lovecraft.
And of course, the New York mongoloid problem is beyond calm mention. The city is befouled and accursed. I come away from it with a sense of having been tainted by contact, and long for some solvent oblivion to wash. How in heaven's name sensitive and self-respecting white men can continue to live in the stew of Asiatic filth which the region has become, with marks and reminders of the locust plague on every hand, is absolutely beyond me.
Pining for his childhood home, Lovecraft returns to Providence in 1926. He takes up residence here on Barn Street. However, his wife does not follow. His aunts have forbidden her to come. God forbid he remain married to a Jew and a common tradeswoman. In 1929, Lovecraft and Sonia are officially divorced. Returning to Providence has rid Lovecraft of his Asiatic neighbors. However, he still has to contend with what he calls his own local curses.
In the form of simian Portuguese, unspeakable Southern Italians, and jabbering French Canadians.
Oh, Lovecraft, you make me laugh. So he marries Sonia, and then, you know, does their marriage, do you know anything about the marriage? I mean, how did it fall apart exactly? Was it just because his aunts were at him to get away from her because she was a Jew? Or you know, do you know of any other factors?
Well, yeah, I mean, he was in Brooklyn and couldn't stand to be away from Providence.
Okay.
He found New York just repellent. I can imagine very easily where he wouldn't make the greatest husband. And I don't really think it had a whole lot to do with her being Jewish, because she was a really, really assimilated Jew.
Okay.
She didn't, from what I know of her, she didn't go to synagogue. They were actually married in an Episcopalian church, as I recall. So she was a really, really assimilated Jew.
So that made it okay for him. That
yeah, he had said in one of his letters that you know, if Jews could sort of abandon their awful culture and accept this obviously superior culture, they would be okay.
okay.
He thought that it was Jewish culture that seemed to be wrong.
Right.
He was a good friend of Houdini's, and he talks about Houdini being peculiarly Asiatic in his thinking, because Houdini actually was a fairly observant Jew, a non-assimilated sort of Jew. So it's like Jewish psychology that somehow bothers him, which he felt he could define.
Right. Lovecraft's wife says that he admired Hitler and read Mein Kampf in one gulp upon its appearance in an English translation.
There surely is an actual Hitler peril, yet that cannot blind us to the honest rightness of the man's basic urge. I repeat that there is a great and pressing need behind every one of the major planks of Hitlerism: racial cultural continuity, conservative cultural ideals, and an escape from the absurdities of Versailles. The crazy thing is not what Adolf wants, but the way he sees it and starts out to get it. I know he's a clown, but by God, I like the boy.
Lovecraft died in 1937. If he had lived, say, another 10 years until after the end of World War II,
then he would have seen what was going on, and he would have seen how far Hitler went in the ideology that he had, and hopefully that would have changed his mind. I mean, it changed most people's minds, certainly.
Right, because there were a lot of people that, even in America, liked Hitler and what Germany was doing on some level.
Because they didn't know how bad he was yet.
Right.
I remember reading When I'm Dead, All This Will Be Yours, which is a memoir written by Teller, Penn and Teller, of his father. And his father was a cartoonist and did these sort of comical cartoons of Hitler in the 30s. And when Teller was looking at these, he said, "Dad, these are like silly, and you're kind of just making him out to be this silly little man." And it was Adolf Hitler. And the father said, "We didn't know how bad he was then. That they came out later. The cartoons were earlier." So Lovecraft dying in 1937 wouldn't have seen the full horror of Hitler's Germany yet, and most people here in the 1930s hadn't.
So we can hope that if he had lived that long, that kind of shock might have...
The newsreel footage that he would have seen
might have given him a good kick in the ass and might have jolted him out of some of his ideas.
I certainly hope so.
Yeah.
I suspect so.
Yeah, me too. Lovecraft thought of himself as a very high-minded man of science. He had at his hands vast amounts of information, the truth at his fingertips, and still he insisted that other races, non-Aryan races, were inferior to his own. What a fool. 1917, World War I is starting, and Lovecraft is justifiably worried. Not about the war per se, but about what he saw as a suicidal race between the Aryan or Teutonic equals. In his mind, the inhabitants of England and Germany are all part of the same race, and therefore shouldn't be battling each other. The Aryan is the pinnacle of civilization. All other races are far below them. These lower races should allow the whites to rule them for their own good.
Pan-Saxonism, the domination by the English and kindred races over the lesser divisions of mankind. The one sound power in the world is the power of a hairy, muscular right arm.
In Lovecraft's day, the northern part of Onlyville was considered to be the black part of Providence. These quotes should give you a good indication of what he thought of that.
What crowds? And that was not the worst. For upon my most solemn oath, I'll be shot if 3 out of every 4 persons, nay, full 9 out of every 10, weren't flabby, pungent, grinning, chattering niggers.
Refrigerator. 1912, a poem by Lovecraft, The Triumph of Nature over Northern Ignorance.
The savage black, the ape-sembling beast, hath held too long his Saturnalian feast. From out the land, by act of faraway heaven, to lingering death his numbers shall be driven. Against God's will the Yankee freed the slave, and in the act consigned him to the grave.
In this poem, Lovecraft hopes to show that blacks are biologically inferior, whose physiological and psychological weaknesses will cause them to perish over time. Lovecraft had a great love for England, a greater love for America.
Americanism. It is the spirit of England, transported to a soil of vast extent and diversity, and nourished for a time under pioneer conditions calculated to increase democratic aspects without impairing its fundamental virtues. It is the expression of the world's highest race, under the most favorable social, political, and geographical conditions. Of the question raised regarding the treatment of the Indian by the white man in America, while the driving back of the Aborigines has indeed been ruthless and high-handed, it seems the destiny of the Anglo-Saxon to sweep inferior races from his path wherever he goes. There are few who love the Indian so deeply that they would wish this continent restored to its original condition, peopled by savage nomads instead of civilized colonists.
The Chinese.
My God, what a filthy dump! A bastard mess of stewing mongrel flesh without intellect, repellent to the eye, nose, and imagination. Would to heaven a kindly gust of cyanogens could asphyxiate the whole gigantic abortion, end the misery, and clear out the place. The organic thing, Italio, Semitico, Mongoloid, inhabiting that awful cesspool, could not by any stretch of the imagination be called human.
The Filipinos.
It is difficult to be patient with the political idiots who advocate the relinquishment of the archipelago by the United States, either now or at any future time. The mongrel natives, in whose blood the Malay strain predominates, are not, and never will be, racially capable of maintaining a civilized condition by themselves.
How about Lovecraft's racism in his stories?
There are elements, if you look at the stories, which I think you can pick out problem areas, so to speak. If you look at Shadow Over Innsmouth, which I think is actually one of his best stories, that whole thing is about miscegenation and two races mixing, and the basic idea is that humans end up interbreeding with these mysterious fish creatures, and the inhabitants of Innsmouth start out as normal folks and slowly transform into the fish creatures, the children of these unions,
right.
And then eventually run into the ocean to join the deep ones.
Okay, so mixing with an inferior race turns you into that inferior race? Is that what he's...
In a way, you decline, you become this kind of half and half degenerate thing. And the interesting thing, actually, now that you make me think of this, is that the fish folk arrive in Innsmouth from Asia when folks leave for the China trade.
Ah, interesting.
And they bring back the worship of one of the gods.
Okay.
And that's when the deep ones, or the whatever they're called, start inhabiting Innsmouth and interbreeding with the people who live there.
Okay, so a foreign culture, a foreign religion.
Another awful Asiatic mongrel race kind of idea.
Okay.
And again, it's two cultures mixing when they shouldn't be, which is a big Lovecraft thing. He seemed to think that people were okay just on their own, but
right.
they shouldn't be mixing. That was wrong.
Okay, so his real life racism brought over into his stories basically as a message to the people. Is he using his stories to get this message out, don't mix with other races?
I don't think so. I think it's just a theme that struck him particularly strongly, and this is the way he chose to explore it. Okay. So I don't think it's a message, but it's an indication of how his brain's wired in a way.
Interesting.
It's one of his obsessions coming out in a somewhat different form.
I know a lot of people are actually bigger fans of his letters throughout the years, more than his works.
You know, huge letter writer.
Yeah, and that's where I know a lot of where we got our material for his racism is out of his letters, his correspondences with other people.
One of the biographies I read quoted a couple of his friends as saying that it was in his letters that he really let loose and came up with this stuff, and that he never, or very, very rarely expressed these things in person, and that he never used the racial epithets out loud that he used in his letters.
Ladies and gentlemen, as impossible as this may seem, I've managed to score an interview with Lovecraft's cat, Nigger Man.
Actually, Adam, I've changed my name.
Changed your name, huh?
Yeah, I mean, you'd walk around these days calling yourself Nigger Man?
I see your point.
Yeah, I'm Fluffy Muhammad now.
Right. Well, we're here today to talk about Lovecraft.
Howie! What a wiener.
So you didn't like Lovecraft?
Couldn't stand him. Kinda creeped me out, so I ran away.
How did he creep you out?
The kid dressed in girls' clothes until he was 7 years old.
But I thought his mother forced him to dress in women's clothes.
Right. Forced him. He liked to pretend he was this blonde-haired, blue-eyed He-Man. He thought he was so tough.
But he wasn't?
Let's just say I wasn't the biggest pussy in the household.
Well, by all accounts, he loved cats. He wrote poems about them.
He was no T.S. Eliot.
So you didn't like his poetry?
It all sucked. Next question.
Okay, we're mostly concerned about his views on race.
Well, the kid had a cat named Nigger Man. But it was more than that. His whole family was racist. I remember when his dad went insane and was imagining phantom Negroes raping his wife.
Really?
Swear to God, they committed him to Butler.
I knew that.
He had syphilis. Caught it from a Chinese hooker.
Are you sure?
Oh yeah, that's why Lovecraft hated Chinese. And Native Americans, and Aborigines, Italians, the French, Filipinos, Portuguese.
Did he like anybody?
White people. Except for the Jews and the French.
Well, the French. Long before it was fashionable, he hated the French.
We don't despise the French in France or Quebec, but we don't want them in grabbing our territory and creating foreign islands like Woonsocket and Fall River.
But he really hated blacks. Didn't even consider them human. He loved the KKK, was a big fan of Hitler. Like I said, he was a wiener.
So how have things been since you ran away?
Pretty good. I spent some time traveling, watch a lot of TV. I spent some time being Robert Heinlein's cat in the 50s, but now I belong to Paul DiFilippo. He's cool.
Well, I'm glad you found some measure of happiness in your life. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you.
In 1935, Lovecraft began suffering from frequent and painful constipation. This was caused by an undiagnosed case of bowel cancer. Refusing to see a doctor until it was far too late, H.P. Lovecraft dies on March 15, 1937. Far too early for his legions of future fans, but far too late to stop another racist scumbag's ignorant ideological ravings. Who do you think Lovecraft would have been today if he had been born in this era and he was in his 20s in 2003? Do you think his views, being raised as he was, say he said had the same type of parents, the same type of family, do you think maybe he'd be a different person? Much more enlightened time now.
I hope. But I suspect that he would probably still be somebody who told the jokes when they weren't around.
Right.
He might be more closeted than he was as far as his racism goes, but perhaps not. Maybe he would have found an internet chat room and
It brought him out.
and that would have brought it out.
Do you think? And what about if he had had a different upbringing? That seems to be a really big influence on him. Having this pretty horrible family and this horrible youth.
It was also the time. There were a lot of immigrants coming into Providence at that time, and Providence was also not the Renaissance city back then. Providence in the 20s and 30s was a really beat up place, and he may have felt that it was because of all those immigrants coming in that was their fault in some way, that they were ruining his beloved Anglo-Saxon Providence.
Someone told me a story about him that he would actually go down to the docks when immigrants were coming in, and he would, tell them, this is not the place for you to be. Go home. This is, this is our white America. What are you doing here?
I hadn't heard that. That's interesting. I don't know if I buy it because I don't know that he was that gregarious and that able to walk up to strangers and speak to them that clearly.
That might be totally false, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry about that.
It wouldn't surprise me if he sat there watching them come off boats and was very annoyed and just thought those things.
A lot of anger.
Probably, yeah.
But he'd probably be, hiding in the shadows.
Yes, probably been bottling that up.
Well, thanks very much.
Not at all.
It's been very enlightening and great seeing you again.
Good seeing you as well.
Right. See you next time.
I'll be here.
Horace Levy, one of Lovecraft's earliest critics and biographers, had this to say about the man. Lovecraft was a man without hope, unstable, sick, unhappy, obstinately rejecting what he considered the delusions of faith, fed on nihilistic philosophies. He had frequent thoughts of suicide. I am Providence. No, Mr. Lovecraft, you most certainly are not.